Hey everybody, so I just did a video about the five best American presidents, so now we'll do, in my opinion, the people who are the five worst US presidents. And as I mentioned in the first video, in considering this list, I am ignoring presidents who had very short terms, like again, James A. Garfield, who only served 6 months, or William Henry Harrison, or who else would belong in there? I guess they serve the shortest terms, but I'm also not considering any president since before 2001, because it's just premature to assess their historical significance or their accomplishments. That's journalism, right? Not history. So, with those kind of caveats, oh, another one would be like Zachary Taylor, right? I mean, he was only president for a little over a year, so I'm not considering him either. But with all of those prefatory things out of the way, let's see what we've got here. So we have all right, well, and this is in order of who I think from worst to least worst. And again, this is not to persuade anybody. I would prefer that you all think for yourselves and come up with your own list. You don't have to take my word for it. So, number one, it's got to be Nixon. It's got to be Richard Nixon. He's got to be the worst U.S. president. Why do I say that? Well, where to begin? Okay, so Nixon ordered his he ordered I'm stumbling over my words. I don't even know where to begin. All right, in the Nixon administration, people were ordered to break into the Democratic National Headquarters to eavesdrop it, or I should say, to install listening devices to eavesdrop on their campaign activities. Nixon, as a candidate in 1968, through his surrogates, undermined the foreign policy of the Johnson administration in regard to trying to come to a resolution in the war in Vietnam, meaning Nixon basically told the North Vietnamese, don't listen to anything Andrew Johnson, Lyndon Johnson is trying to tell you. Just wait for me to get in office, and you'll get something better. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say the North Vietnamese. I mean the South Vietnamese, who are the allies of the United States. That is, Nixon basically told the South Vietnamese, keep fighting, don't acquiesce in Lyndon Johnson's demands to form a truce with the North, because once Nixon's in office, we'll get everything squared away. And that prolonged the war. Nixon also, under his administration, ordered the break-in of a psychiatrist's office to uncover damaging material in the files of Daniel Ellsberg, who was the Pentagon Papers whistleblower. Again, it's not so much necessarily that Nixon ordered these personally, although maybe he did, but his cronies definitely did, who reported to Nixon. Nixon is on tape talking about, in derogatory ways, Jews and black people, and of course other presidents did that too, but Nixon kind of had a real bite to it. And Nixon expanded the Vietnam War rather than ending it as soon as he got into office, which is sort of what he promised to do. He talked about having a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. It was so secret he didn't even know what it was. He had no plan. His plan was simply to expand the bombing into Cambodia and into Laos, and more people died in the Vietnam War. Certainly Americans, but surely Vietnamese as well. But more people died in the Vietnam War after Nixon's election than preceding it, even though more time the Vietnam War had lasted longer before Nixon's election. That is to say, it started. It had been going on for a longer time before Nixon got in office than lasted after he got out of office. Nixon almost single-handedly eroded trust in the American political system by being corrupt and by lying and by his conniving. He was a petty person who had enemies lists with journalists and prominent people on it. So again, not every people cannot be reduced to the worst thing they ever did, and Nixon is also responsible for affirmative action and for the creation of the Environmental Protection Association, or I should say agency. He did some things that, of course, were positive. But for the love of all that is sacred, nothing he did outweighs the monumental tragedy and embarrassment of the Watergate fiasco, in which ultimately he was compelled to resign. The first and only, hopefully, president to resign, and he was nearly the second president to be impeached. The impeachment process had actually started. Nixon, there are many contenders for this top prize, I must say, but for me, Nixon's dishonesty, his deviousness, makes him the worst, in my opinion, by far, U.S. president. In so many ways. But our runner-up is poor James Buchanan. Buchanan. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, the only bachelor president, the only president from Pennsylvania. If you see pictures of Buchanan, you will notice that his head is sort of cocked to one side, and that's because he had trouble seeing out of his right eye, and so he kind of favored his left eye. And when pictures were taken, or paintings for that matter, he kind of cocked his good eye up. And look, here's the deal with Buchanan, gang. Buchanan had no clue, and his cluelessness accelerated the dissolution of the United States and the breakdown of the political system, which resulted in the Civil War. Had Buchanan been a staunch defender of the Union, or at least been more clear in his politics, maybe the Civil War would not have occurred. Maybe it would have, of course, but Buchanan's aimlessness definitely made it inevitable. To be specific here, he was elected in 1856, and so of course was inaugurated in 1857. Well, that was the same year in which the Dred Scott case was brought to the Supreme Court, and that was a infamous Supreme Court ruling in which the Chief Justice Taney from Maryland said that, among other things, black people, whether free or slave, were not citizens of the United States, and that the black man, he said, had no rights which white people were bound to recognize. That's practically a direct quote. And Buchanan sort of, he said, "Hey, I'll take it." And in fact, there's some evidence that Buchanan was aware that that decision was going to be rendered that way, and so just before his inauguration, or just before the decision was going to be handed down, released a statement that said, hey, whatever the Supreme Court says, we should respect it and abide by it. But in fact, he knew what it was going to be beforehand, and so tipped the scales a little bit. Furthermore, he was president during 1859 when John Brown, the Northern abolitionist, attacked Harper's Ferry, and Buchanan sort of just sat in the White House and didn't grow a beard. And Buchanan stocked his cabinet and advisors with Southern people who were sympathetic to secession, which by definition did not help avoid the Civil War. And look, I get it. If you believe that the United States should have dissolved in 1861, and if you don't mind that, if you think that it was constitutional to do that, that's fine. But nevertheless, the Civil War cost about 800,000 lives, and so that's not a good thing. So regardless of what you think of the political aspects of the Civil War, as a human tragedy, it is unequaled in American history. And so if you are partly responsible for it through your ineptitude, your favoritism of one side, your complicity in manifestly unfair judicial decisions, you got to be number two. I mean, Nixon beats out Buchanan. And I should say Buchanan was not a malicious person. He was not someone who hated the North or hated black people. He was not someone who woke up every day thinking how he could foment catastrophe. However, he was a weak-willed person who was confronted with an entirely complex and sophisticated situation, and he simply had no idea what he was doing, and he was just in over his head. And so he might not have been actively bad like Nixon. He was still pretty bad, in my view. So Buchanan, number two. As his runner-up, we've got this one. His immediate predecessor, Franklin Pierce, who is from New Hampshire and a very handsome person. Some people say that Franklin Pierce looked like the ideal U.S. president. You kind of want to agree with that. He was a war veteran, a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War, and a generally very nice man. Went to college at Bowdoin with Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote his campaign biography. But like Buchanan, the reason Franklin Pierce is on this list is because he was weak-willed, he was incompetent. I hate saying these things. These people are dead, and could I have done better than they did? Probably not. But an historian's perspective is that Franklin Pierce, like Buchanan, stocked his cabinet with Southern sympathizers who acted in the interest of the South, not for the interests of the whole United States. That Franklin Pierce showed lack of fortitude in confronting Southern secessionists, in confronting the national issues that eventually resulted in the dissolution of the United States, or at least the almost dissolution. So some examples would be in 1855 and 1856, the United States was confronted with the situation in so-called bloody Kansas. This was in fact what amounted to a little civil war in the territory of Kansas between abolitionists and people who supported slavery. Franklin Pierce just sort of let it happen. He didn't intervene. If anything, he supported the people who supported slavery and their fake, I shouldn't say fake, but the illegitimate Lecompton Constitution adopted by Kansas. And so Franklin Pierce had several opportunities to stifle Southern nationalism, which again, it was only a good idea. if you want to avoid civil war. And he just didn't do it. He was content to let his Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, who became president of the Confederacy. Anyway, Jefferson Davis sort of took resources from the South, excuse me, from the North, military resources, and brought them south, which is where they were when the South seceded. So the South had so much military hardware in its possession when southern states seceded, because Jefferson Davis put them there years before, transferred them there. It's kind of quasi-treason, if you will. But so if Franklin Pierce, again, did he know that the Civil War was going to happen? Probably not. But nevertheless, had he been a little more balanced, a little less sympathetic toward the South, it is possible that the Civil War could have been averted, because Franklin Pierce, like James Buchanan, their acquiescence toward Southern demands didn't satisfy the South. It simply caused them to intensify. The South wanted more and more territory, more minority rights. I don't mean rights for minorities, but I mean in the sense that the Southern population was smaller and had fewer states. They nevertheless demanded an equal share in government, even though that's not the way majority rule is supposed to work. It's supposed to be ruled by the majority. So in any event, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan just sort of kind of soft and malleable and what's the word, like too spongy at a time when sternness and foresight were called for. I'm sorry, it's just too bad, but it's true. Okay. Fourth, oops. Well, see, I haven't been listing the first name, but now I have. But oh well. I try to be consistent, but too bad. So Andrew Johnson, and the case here. So he was President Lincoln's second vice president. He was a Democrat from Tennessee. He was illiterate until his wife taught him to read. Not that that's a terrible thing, but he was not a highly educated person. He was a tailor. But he was a Democrat from the South who supported the Union cause in the Civil War, and so that made him a rare and hot commodity, which was why he was Lincoln's vice president. But when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson was elevated to the presidency, and he proceeded to make a mess of everything. It was thought that Johnson would be vindictive toward the Southern people, whom he was claimed to despise. He hated the planters, the rich planters of the South, because he was kind of a poor guy and all that. But Johnson, in fact, was sympathetic toward the South, his native land. He wanted to be very lenient toward the South, but in fact too lenient, right? Because Lincoln wanted to be lenient, but Johnson was too lenient. Forget about loyalty oaths and let's not worry too much about the rights of freed black people from slavery. And, sure, let's let the Congress be populated by people who had supported secession prior to 1861. Johnson was basically willing to allow the South to win the peace, even though it had lost the war. So he was against the rights for freed African Americans. He was against reining in the hostile population of the South that was really content to continue fighting for all intents and purposes. I don't mean the war itself, but I just mean keeping hostilities alive rather than some sense of camaraderie. And so Johnson was generally a mess. And he was eventually, of course, impeached by the Republican-dominated Congress. And he was nearly removed from office, but for the vote of one person in the Senate. That is to say, he was impeached by the House. He was up for a vote in the Senate. If he had been convicted in the Senate, he would have been removed, but he fell one vote short of being convicted, and so he stayed in office. But after that episode, he was kind of powerless and sort of just sat around drinking. He was indeed notoriously drunk at Lincoln's inauguration, the second inauguration. So Johnson made a mess of the post-Civil War politics in the United States, and that left a lasting impact. Had Lincoln been president, he would have done things far more wisely, and but Johnson was no Lincoln. Right, and so finally, well, I guess it's good that I put his first name because we're going to do this. Right. Because his unrelated fellow president, but with the same last name, Lyndon Johnson, is the fifth worst president, in my opinion. And this one is a little bit tricky, and here's why. Because Lyndon Johnson was responsible as president for signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and with promoting the creation of Head Start, and for getting Medicaid and Medicare, I suppose. Johnson was responsible for building what little we have as a social safety system in this country, and for accelerating and recognizing the achievements of black folks during the civil rights movement. Again, obviously, that's not to say that he's responsible for them accomplishing. People who participate in the civil rights have only themselves and their allies to thank for what they accomplished. But Lyndon Johnson was nevertheless instrumental in politically helping them to achieve their aims. Regardless, so Lyndon Johnson, he did many good things. He did many good things legislatively. However, Johnson's single-minded dedication to involving the United States in the war in Vietnam, in my opinion, simply mitigates and really overwhelms any of his positive contributions. That's not to say they were more important than that, but I'm saying on the scales of where you rank someone, the Vietnam War was such a monumental catastrophe with such long-lasting and enormous effects that Johnson was really the most responsible person for U.S. involvement in that war, that it really takes away from anything good he did, which is not, again, in any way some kind of radical perspective. But here's my point, is that prior to the war in Vietnam, the United States was on its way to developing a strong social safety net that is now common in Scandinavia and in Great Britain and in Japan and Germany and Switzerland and France and the Netherlands and Belgium, and every other industrial country has a strong social safety net so that people do not go bankrupt when they don't have health care, because they all have health care, where people have paid maternity leave and paid paternity leave, and they have free tuition, and they have excellent infrastructure, and they have peaceful relations with the world, and they have plenty of money for education, and they have equality of wealth and equality of status, where they have women represented in government, where they have only a small, relatively small percentage of their money going to national defense rather than an enormous percentage, where they have politicians who are elected in free elections that are not contaminated by money. So the United States in 1964, for example, was on a path toward becoming like so many of these other civilized societies that we see overseas. But the war in Vietnam totally derailed that. The war in Vietnam took the United States to a vastly different place of social rebellion, of military primacy, of mistrust or distrust of government, of a disconnection between government and the people that it supposedly serves. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the bombs dropped on Vietnam fall at home or land at home. I can't remember exactly what he said, but his point was that we're dropping bombs in Vietnam, but the explosions really ripple in American society, and he was absolutely right about that. So after the war in Vietnam, the United States was a fractured society, a broken society, one in which people distrusted the government, and indeed their distrust was absolutely affirmed in the fiasco of Watergate. And so if you look at the United States in, say, 1964, before the war in Vietnam really accelerated in August of that year with the resolutions in August of that year to expand presidential powers, the name of which I, of course, conveniently forget at this moment. But anyway, the United States was heading toward a social democracy, one which valued people, one in which profits and business were not the ultimate goal, one in which people were valued as individuals. But after the war in Vietnam, the United States became one in which corporatism and abuse of minority people, disrespect for their rights, became much more tolerated. Of course, it's taken a long time for that to emerge, but the social safety net, had Johnson not had the Vietnam War, had he avoided it somehow, I think he would have been one of the best United States presidents, because he was someone who cared about the poor, he cared about the marginalized, he cared about children, he cared about education, he cared about leveling American society so that people had an equal opportunity and an equal chance. Johnson was, in fact, a good person who had the right goals, in my opinion, for this country, but he was intent on not being the first person to lose a war. In the United States, that is. He was intent on being better, quote unquote, than John F. Kennedy was in every way. And one way that he wanted to be better was to show that he could act in Vietnam in a way that was stronger than Kennedy had done. But what those policies resulted in was a 10-year conflict costing 58,000 American lives and somewhere between 2 million or around 2 million lives in Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia, even more so, and causing a ripple effect that continues to this day. So for his involvement, for his irrational his single-minded dedication to winning this unwinnable war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, unfortunately, has to be ranked as one of the worst U.S. presidents, in my opinion. I hate to put him there because he had such potential, but he blew it, and that is an understatement. Had the war in Vietnam not occurred, the United States would probably be much more like one of the civilized Western European countries, or again, like Japan, for example, where you're not screwed if you lose your job. You're not doomed if you have an accident and you don't have health insurance, where you're not crushed by debt if you happen to go to college, where you don't have 90% of the wealth controlled by a tiny percentage of the people. That would not have been the way that the U.S. would have developed. But the Vietnam War simply it just detached the United States from the direction it was heading. And I think that if you study that period, you'll come to the same conclusion. But that's my view in a nutshell. And so here is the ignominious list of the 5 worst presidents, in my opinion. Again, come up with your own list if you like, but this is mine. It's too bad, but there they are. But nevertheless, I do appreciate you watching this video and hope that it was marginally interesting at least. And see you next time.